Don't eat that!
What? Why?
At exactly 8:17 p.m., inside a private dining room in Westchester County, a man named Ethan Whitmore lifted a fork toward his mouth, surrounded by people who had watched him build a fortune over 3 decades, people who trusted him, respected him, and in some cases depended on him. And just inches before the food reached his lips, a small voice cut through the room with a kind of urgency no one there could ignore. A voice that did not belong to power or wealth or authority, but to a child. The room didn't react at first, because moments like that don't register immediately, especially in places where everything is controlled, where nothing is supposed to go wrong. And yet something in the way she said it, the sharpness, the certainty, made the laughter fade, made the air feel heavier, as if everyone understood at once that something had shifted, something that could not be undone. She said it again, louder this time. Don't eat that. And this time the words landed, not as a suggestion, but as a warning, one that forced Ethan's hand to stop midair, the fork hovering, his expression changing from polite distraction to something far more serious. Because in that second, he had to make a choice, trust the life he had built, or trust a child who had no reason to lie. What no one at that table knew, what none of the guests' laughing moments before could have imagined, was that this interruption was not random, it was not confusion, and it was not a mistake, because earlier that evening, just minutes before the first plates were served, something had happened in the kitchen, something small, almost invisible, something that would have gone completely unnoticed, if not for the one person who saw it. And what she saw, what she would soon describe in front of everyone, didn't just stop a dinner. It exposed a plan that had been quietly set into motion, a plan tied to trust, to money, and to a relationship that, until that moment, had looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Who would try to poison a millionaire at his own engagement dinner, in a room filled with people who knew him, people who could identify every face, every movement, every detail, and yet still believe they were safe. Why would anyone take that kind of risk, knowing that one mistake could expose everything in seconds, knowing that there would be no quiet exit, no second chance to explain it away? And how did a little girl, someone no one was paying attention to, someone who was never meant to be part of that moment, see what everyone else missed, including the man whose life was on the line? Because what she noticed was not obvious, it was not loud, and it was not meant to be seen at all. To understand what really happened that night, and why that warning came at exactly the moment it did, we have to go back, before the dinner, before the engagement, to the people involved, the choices they made, and the version of the truth that had been carefully maintained until it finally began to fall apart. Ethan Whitmore wasn't just wealthy, he was disciplined, the kind of man who woke up before sunrise, who built routines and followed them without compromise, a man who turned a modest construction business into a multi-state operation that brought in millions every year, not through luck, but through control, patience, and decisions made when others hesitated. By the time he was 52, he had everything most men spend their lives trying to secure: financial stability, influence, and a name that carried weight in every room he entered. But there was one thing his success had never managed to solve, and that was the quiet absence waiting for him when the workday ended, the part of life that couldn't be negotiated or earned, someone to share it with. Then came Victoria Lane, and from the beginning, she seemed to fit into his world with ease, younger, composed, and fully aware of how to present herself in a way that made people listen without ever raising her voice. She had a presence that drew attention without asking for it, the kind of woman who didn't just enter a room, she set the tone for it, adjusting her words, her expressions, even her silence with precision. To Ethan, she represented a future he had delayed for too long, someone who brought warmth into a life that had been built on structure, someone who understood the balance between ambition and comfort, and for a time, everything about her made sense. But to some of the people around him, those who had known him for years, there was something about Victoria that didn't fully settle, something difficult to define, but impossible to ignore, a feeling that things were moving faster than they should. What Ethan didn't know, what never crossed his mind as he introduced her to friends, as he placed a ring on her finger, as he began to plan a life that finally felt complete, was that Victoria wasn't navigating this world alone. There were moments he didn't see, conversations that didn't include him, and connections that existed entirely outside the structure he trusted so deeply. Somewhere beyond the routines he relied on, beyond the carefully managed image of their relationship, there was someone else, someone who understood a different version of Victoria, a version that had never been shown at the dinner table, and certainly not to the man who believed he knew her best. The dinner was meant to be private, carefully arranged inside Ethan Whitmore's estate with a guest list limited to people he trusted, longtime associates, a few close friends, and family members who had watched his life unfold over the years. There were no reporters, no cameras, no outside noise, just a controlled environment where everything was expected to go exactly as planned, where the evening would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one built on commitment, stability, and the belief that he had finally found the right person to share it with. Conversations moved easily across the table, glasses were raised, and for a while, nothing about the night suggested that anything was out of place. At some point during the evening, as the first course gave way to the next, Victoria Lane excused herself from the table with the kind of calm confidence no one questioned, the kind that made even small movements seem routine. She stepped into the kitchen area, away from the attention of the guests, away from Ethan, and for a brief moment, she was alone with the details that most people never think twice about: the preparation, the arrangement, the final touches before a dish is served. It didn't take long, just a few seconds, just enough time for something small to be introduced, something that wouldn't draw attention, something that blended into everything else. No one at the table noticed her absence in any meaningful way. No one followed. No one asked questions, because there was no reason to. No one, except someone who had no role in the evening, someone who had no reason to be paying attention, but did. She wasn't part of the dinner, not in the way the others were. She wasn't seated at the table, wasn't involved in the conversations, and to most of the guests, she barely existed within the structure of the event. She moved quietly, staying close to the edges of the room, observing without being acknowledged, the kind of presence that fades into the background without effort. But from where she stood, she had a clear view of the moment Victoria stepped into the kitchen, and more importantly, of what happened next. She saw something that didn't fit, something small and quick, but deliberate enough to leave an impression. And by the time Victoria returned to the table, by the time the next plate was set in front of Ethan Whitmore, that observation had already settled into something more certain. Seconds later, as Ethan reached for his fork, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room without hesitation. "Don't eat that." At first, no one believed her, because nothing about the accusation fit the setting, the people, or the moment itself. A child, standing in the middle of a formal engagement dinner, pointing toward a woman who had just been welcomed into Ethan Whitmore's life, claiming that something had been done to his food, it disrupted the logic everyone in that room relied on. Victoria Lane's reaction was immediate, controlled but firm, a look of disbelief mixed with offense, as though the accusation itself was more damaging than anything it implied. Around the table, guests exchanged glances, some dismissive, others uncertain, because it didn't make sense. Not yet, not in a way anyone was ready to accept. But then something shifted, not all at once, but enough to change how the moment felt. The certainty in the girl's voice didn't fade under pressure. It held, steady and direct, as she repeated what she had seen without hesitation, without adjusting her words to fit the reactions around her. Ethan didn't move, his hands still hovering near the plate, his attention no longer on the dinner, but on the possibility that something in front of him required a different kind of judgment. And slowly, the confidence that had defined the evening began to weaken, replaced by a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if she was right? She pointed directly at Victoria, not vaguely, not uncertainly, but with a level of clarity that made it difficult to dismiss. She said she saw her in the kitchen, said she watched her take something small, something white, and pour it into the sauce before returning to the table as if nothing had happened. The words landed differently this time, no longer dismissed as confusion, but considered, measured against the silence that had taken over the room. Victoria responded quickly, denying it, her tone sharper now, her composure still intact, but under pressure, as attention shifted fully toward her. And just like that, the dinner was no longer a celebration. It had become something else entirely, something that demanded answers. Authorities were called, not immediately with certainty, but with enough concern to justify action, and within a short time, The controlled environment of the dinner was replaced by a different kind of order. The food was collected, handled carefully, treated not as a meal but as potential evidence. While statements were taken, timelines were established, and every detail of the evening began to be reconstructed piece by piece. What had started as a single interruption was now an investigation, one that moved quickly because the implications were too serious to ignore. And when the initial tests came back, when the results were no longer speculation but fact, what they found didn't just raise suspicion. It confirmed that something had been placed into Ethan Whitmore's food, something that was never meant to be there. And in that moment, everything changed. There was something in the food, a substance identified during testing that had no place in any kitchen, let alone one preparing a private meal inside Ethan Whitmore's home. It wasn't accidental contamination, and it wasn't harmless. The findings were precise enough to confirm intent, precise enough to shift the entire situation from suspicion to something far more serious. But even then, even with that confirmation, it still left one question unanswered, the one that mattered most. Because the presence of the substance explained what had happened, but it didn't explain why someone would choose that moment, that setting, and that level of risk to carry it out. The real shock came when investigators moved beyond the dinner itself and began examining Victoria Lane's life outside of what Ethan knew. What they found wasn't a single mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern, a separate narrative that had been unfolding quietly over time. There were messages, consistent and deliberate, exchanges that revealed coordination, planning, and a level of detail that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Phone records, deleted conversations, and financial traces pointed to something far more calculated than anyone at the table had imagined, something that suggested this wasn't a decision made in a moment, but one developed over weeks, possibly months. Victoria wasn't acting alone, and once that became clear, the focus shifted to the person on the other side of those messages, someone who had remained completely outside Ethan Whitmore's world. He wasn't part of the business, wasn't part of the social circle, and had never been introduced in any capacity that would raise concern. But the connection was undeniable, and as investigators followed it further, the structure of the plan began to take shape. It wasn't just about removing Ethan from the picture, it was about what would happen immediately after, how quickly everything could be transferred, how cleanly a new life could begin without drawing attention. She intended to disappear, not gradually, not with explanation, but completely, leaving behind a version of events that could be controlled long enough to secure what mattered most. The messages outlined more than just intent. They described timing, locations, and the steps needed to avoid immediate suspicion. And at the center of it all was the assumption that nothing would interrupt the process, that no one would question the sequence of events once it had begun. But that assumption failed in the one place it couldn't afford to, in a moment that no one involved had anticipated, when a single observation from someone they had overlooked brought everything to a halt and exposed a plan that was never meant to be seen. But the plan had one flaw, and it wasn't in the timing or the preparation or even in the execution of what had been set in motion that night. It was in the assumption that everything surrounding Ethan Whitmore was predictable, that every person in that room would act according to expectation, that no one outside that structure would interrupt what had already been carefully arranged. What investigators later confirmed made that even clearer, because this wasn't something Victoria Lane decided in a moment. It had been developing over time, supported by legal adjustments that had quietly shifted control of certain assets, documents that placed her in a position to act quickly once Ethan was gone. She had been preparing for it in ways that didn't draw attention, changes that appeared routine on the surface but carried long-term consequences if left unchecked. Financial access had been expanded, authorizations updated, and certain decisions had been positioned to take effect without delay, all of it structured to ensure that once the plan moved forward, there would be very little standing in her way. From the outside, it looked like progression, the natural merging of two lives, but underneath it, there was a different intention entirely, one that relied on precision and silence. She didn't expect anyone to notice, not the guests, not the staff, and certainly not someone who had no reason to be involved in any of it. The idea that a child, someone outside the circle of influence and expectation, would become the point where everything stopped was never part of the calculation. And yet, That is exactly where it failed, not because the plan was incomplete, but because it was observed at the one moment it needed to remain unseen. In the end, it wasn't security that saved Ethan Whitmore, it wasn't the systems he had built to protect his wealth, and it wasn't the influence he carried in the rooms he entered. None of those things played a role in the moment that mattered most. What saved him was attention, a single moment of awareness from someone who chose to speak when everyone else remained silent, someone who recognized that something didn't fit and refused to ignore it. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones we understand the least, and the difference between what we believe and what is actually true doesn't reveal itself in obvious ways. It shows up in small, easily overlooked moments, the kind that pass by unnoticed unless someone is willing to stop, question, and say something when it matters. What do you think? If you were sitting at that table beside Ethan Whitmore, with everything in front of you appearing exactly as it should, would you have believed her, or would you have dismissed it as a mistake, something set out of place in a moment that didn't seem to require caution? And more importantly, looking back at everything that led up to that night, the small changes, the quiet adjustments, the details that didn't quite stand out on their own, would you have noticed any of it before it reached that point? Or would it have passed the same way it did for everyone else in that room? Because situations like this rarely begin with something obvious, they build over time, in ways that feel ordinary until they are forced into the open, and by then, the outcome depends on whether someone is willing to question what others accept without hesitation. If this story surprised you, if the outcome wasn't what you expected when it began, then there's another story that takes this even further, one where the truth stayed hidden much longer and the consequences reached even deeper. Subscribe, because the next one might change the way you look at everything you think you understand.